All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that's been debated for, well, centuries really, and that's what does it actually mean to be human?
The big one.
It is a big one, and we're diving into your collection of sources here to unpack a really influential idea, the blank slate.
Right.
So this is the idea that we are born without any kind of built-in mental software, so to speak, and everything we become, everything we are, is shaped and written by our experiences and the culture that we are raised in.
Right. So it's all nurture, no nature.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And this idea has had a huge impact on how we understand ourselves and our societies. I mean, it's kind of foundational in a lot of ways.
It is. It's everywhere.
It is. So we're going to explore where it came from, how it's been used, and maybe more importantly, what current science suggests might be a more accurate picture.
Yeah, because it's a very appealing idea in many ways.
It is.
But it might not hold up to scrutiny.
Yeah, exactly. So before we get into all that, I think it's important to recognize that this idea of the blank slate doesn't exist in isolation. It sort of travels with a few, well, companions, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Yeah. A couple of the big ones that come to mind are, first of all, the noble savage.
Right.
This, romantic image of humans in their natural state as inherently good and peaceful.
And only corrupted by civilization.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
If only we could get back to that, everything would be fine.
Right. The garden. Right.
Yeah, exactly. The other one is the ghost in the machine.
Ah.
Now, this one, it goes back to Descartes, but the term itself was coined by the philosopher Gilbert Ryle, I think it was,
Right.
to kind of critique this idea of the mind as a separate, non-physical entity, something apart from the biological workings of the body.
Right. So the idea here is that if the blank slate says we start empty, the noble savage implies that that empty state is inherently good.
Right.
And then the ghost in the machine offers a kind of separate operating system for that emptiness to operate within.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so our mission today, as we go through these sources, is to really understand the historical and intellectual roots of these interconnected ideas, I think. We want to look at the evidence presented for and against them in these materials, and ultimately, hopefully, paint a more complete picture of the complexities of human nature.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to understand these aren't just, dusty philosophical concepts.
Right.
They've had a very real impact on, well, on pretty much everything.
Yeah.
On how we've approached education, social policy, and even, basic assumptions about human potential and our limitations.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. Where did these ideas about human nature first take root? Your sources point to religion as a significant early influence. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, it's fascinating how the Judeo-Christian tradition in particular provided some of the earliest kind of frameworks for thinking about what makes us human. For example, in that tradition, humans are seen as unique creations made in God's image. So right away, you have that setting them apart from the animal kingdom, establishing a sense of inherent difference, not a blank slate shared with other creatures.
Right.
And then there were also, of course, very specific ideas about gender roles with women, often seen as secondary to men, derived from and meant to be ruled by them.
Right.
So hardly a blank slate in terms of social expectations there.
No, not at all. And what about the mind itself within this religious framework? How was that conceived?
So the mind, or the soul, I should say, was largely conceived of as something immaterial, a ghost, if you like,
Right.
possessing abilities beyond the purely physical.
Right, of course. Yeah.
So this includes, of course, the idea of an afterlife, that the soul survives the body, but also, and very importantly, it was believed to have certain inherent capacities, like a moral compass, an ability to love, a power of reason to distinguish right from wrong. These weren't seen as, things that were learned solely from experience, but were God-given attributes.
Right. That definitely lays a foundation, a unique human, distinct from animals with inherent moral sense. So how did the Enlightenment thinkers then build upon or push back against these ideas? Because it feels like there was a real clash of perspectives happening there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The Enlightenment was definitely a pivotal era, offering some, let's just say, dramatically different viewpoints.
Right.
You had thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, for example, who had a pretty bleak outlook, I'd say.
Yeah.
He envisioned humans in their natural state as essentially savage.
Yeah.
Driven by self-interest,
Yeah.
constantly at war with each other, requiring a strong authority to impose order.
Right. The Leviathan.
Exactly, yeah. On the other hand, you had, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau,
Yes.
who famously, but maybe not quite accurately, championed the idea of the noble savage. living in that state of natural innocence and simplicity, with civilization actually being the corrupting influence.
Right. So it's striking that even with such opposite conclusions about human nature, Hobbes seeing savages as needing control and Rousseau seeing them as inherently good, there were, according to your sources, some surprising commonalities in their thinking.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Both Hobbes and Rousseau, and again, this is not quite accurate based on what we know from anthropology, imagine these natural humans as quite isolated,
Hmm.
lacking these complex social bonds like love or loyalty. They didn't really see them as having, developed skills or arts. And in fact, Rousseau even went so far as to suggest they might not even have had language.
Wow.
So despite these, wildly different evaluations of this pre-civilized state, they both shared this vision of a rather solitary and unsophisticated human being.
Well, it makes you wonder how they envision society even starting. If everyone was so isolated, how did they ever come together?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe they didn't think that far ahead.
Right, right. Well, it's an interesting point, for sure. Okay, so we mentioned Descartes earlier and his official theory. How does this dualism of mind and body that he proposed connect with this kind of evolving understanding of human nature?
Well, Descartes' philosophy is absolutely central to this whole ghost in the machine idea.
Okay.
He proposed this really fundamental split between mind and body. So the body, in his view, is physical, it operates in space, and it follows these mechanical laws, just like any other physical object.
Right.
But the mind, crucially, is not physical, it doesn't take up space, and its workings aren't subject to those same mechanical laws. It's this separate thinking substance.
Okay.
Gilbert Ryle, as I mentioned earlier, later kind of playfully labeled this the official theory. It's the view that lots of people just implicitly accept.
Okay. So this non-physical mind residing in and kind of directing a physical body, how does the blank slate concept then become a convenient partner for this ghost in the machine?
Well, think about it. If you have this separate immaterial mind in charge, right? A blank slate for that mind is a very accommodating idea.
Right. Okay.
If the mind is meant to be the primary driver, the body, the hardware, if you will, can be relatively basic at birth.
Right.
The ghost can then learn and develop based on the sensory information it receives through the body without needing a lot of pre-programmed instincts or knowledge.
Ah, I see.
So the less innate structure you assume, the physical body and the brain, the more power and freedom you can attribute to that non-physical mind in shaping behavior.
Right. So it's almost like the blank slate makes more room for this powerful, independent ghost.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And actually, I'm realizing now that this ghost in the machine idea also fits really well with the noble savage concept.
It does, doesn't it?
If the body, the machine, is acting in ignoble ways, you can sort of blame the freely choosing ghost for making those bad decisions without having to consider any inherent flaws in the machine's design.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can say that the machine itself is inherently good. It's only the ghost's bad choices that are causing the problems.
Right, right. So these three ideas really do seem to form a kind of interconnected philosophical package. Now let's shift gears a little bit and look at how the blank slate idea rose to prominence in the social sciences, because your sources detail its significant influence in these fields, especially in the early to mid-20th century. So where did we see this happening most strongly?
Well, one of the most significant areas was the rise of strict behaviorism in psychology.
Okay.
Thinkers like B.F. Skinner, John B. Watson.
Right.
They really emphasized learning through environmental conditioning, associating stimuli with responses.
Right.
And they largely dismissed the importance of, internal mental states altogether.
Really?
Yeah. And they tended to view organisms, whether they were rats, pigeons, or humans, as fundamentally similar in how they learned.
Interesting.
And they focused almost entirely on observable behavior and its consequences.
Right. So this approach obviously aligned with the blank slate, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it implied that virtually all behavior could be shaped by manipulating the environment.
Right.
Now, what's really interesting is that your sources point out that there are a lot of topics that most people consider pretty central to human experience that were strangely absent from a lot of early psychology textbooks.
Okay, like what?
Well, we're talking about things like love, hate, work, play, food preferences, sex, status, dominance, jealousy, friendship.
Wow.
Even things like religion and art.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's almost like they were deliberately avoiding these kind of messy, complicated aspects of human experience.
Yeah, it is remarkable, isn't it? Yeah. But the intense focus on simple forms of learning meant that these richer aspects of human life were largely considered outside the scope of scientific inquiry at the time. It's kind of like it's as if they were studying the basic input-output functions of a computer without ever acknowledging the complex software it could run.
Right. They were just focused on the hardware. Okay. And beyond psychology, the blank slate also had a profound impact on anthropology,
It did.
particularly through the work of Franz Boas.
Right. Yeah. Franz Boas, really influential figure. He championed the idea of cultural determinism.
Okay.
So he argued very persuasively that the differences we observe between human groups, they're primarily due to cultural factors.
Okay.
Shared beliefs, values, practices, the things that are transmitted through language and social interaction rather than, inherent biological or racial differences.
Right.
And, he really went out of his way to kind of deliberately choose to speak of, Eskimo culture or Jewish culture rather than Eskimo race or Jewish race.
Right.
Really emphasized the power of culture in shaping human behavior and thought.
Right. And it makes sense given the historical context.
Oh, absolutely.
Coming out of the horrors of World War II and the eugenics movement, there was this understandable desire to push back against any notion of biological determinism.
Absolutely. And Boas really, really pushed this idea that we should assume complex human activities are socially determined unless proven otherwise.
Right.
And this was, a really powerful weapon against racist ideologies that claimed inherent biological superiority.
Absolutely. So this emphasis on culture as the primary driver seems to have extended even further, right? Even to the concept of a superorganism, according to your sources. So what's the thinking behind that idea?
Well, the superorganism concept takes this idea of the primacy of the group even further. It suggests that the group itself, whether it's a society, a nation, whatever, possesses a kind of collective consciousness, almost as if, individuals are merely cells within this larger social organism.
Wow.
It's really a kind of top-down view of human behavior,
Right.
where the individual is largely shaped and directed by the needs and the dynamics of the group.
Right. And this wasn't just an academic idea, was it? It seems like organizations like UNESCO actively promoting these ideas, especially in the aftermath of World War II.
Yeah, absolutely. In the shadow of the Holocaust, the horrors of World War II, there was a very powerful and understandable desire to reject any notion of biological determinism or racial hierarchy.
Right.
And so thinkers like Ashley Montagu were very influential in shaping UNESCO's stance, leading to resolutions that explicitly denounced racial theories and emphasized the fundamental malleability of human nature and the autonomy of culture.
It makes sense. Given that recent history, it's clear why there was such a strong push to move away from any ideas that could be used to justify discrimination and violence.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So the blank slate and the power of culture offered a real sense of optimism, didn't they? The idea that if we could just reshape the environment and culture, we could potentially overcome social problems, maybe even create a better human future.
Precisely, yeah. Many social scientists saw this human malleability as the key to progress.
Right.
They believed that the problems we faced, inequality, conflict, injustice, these weren't inherent to our nature, but they were products of flawed social structures and cultural practices. So by understanding how culture shapes us, they hoped we could intentionally engineer better societies and, by extension, better human beings.
I see. So it was a very hopeful perspective.
It was, yeah. Very utopian.
And there was even this argument for the sui generis nature of culture, the idea that it could only be explained by itself, which sounds a bit like saying the answer is in the answer.
It does have that kind of circularity to it, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
But the idea was that culture was a phenomenon of its own kind, fundamentally different from biological or psychological processes. And therefore, to truly understand it, you only needed to look at other aspects of culture.
Okay.
It's interesting to think about how this was actually analogous to some earlier views in biology, like this idea of élan vital, this special life force.
Right.
That supposedly couldn't be reduced to, mere physical chemistry.
Right. So it was like this mysterious force that animated life.
Exactly. So just as life was once seen as autonomous, some social scientists argue that culture was equally autonomous.
Yeah.
A self-contained system that didn't need any grounding in, biology or individual psychology.
Interesting. It's fascinating to see how these intellectual currents were flowing at the time. But then, of course, the cognitive revolution came along and really started to shake things up.
It did, didn't it?
So how did this new way of thinking about the mind challenge the dominance of the blank slate?
Well, the cognitive revolution, which really kind of took hold in the mid-20th century, offered a radically different perspective on the mind.
Okay.
I mean, one key development was this idea called the computational theory of mind.
Okay.
And this provided a really powerful alternative to the ghost in the machine
Right.
because it demonstrated how intelligence and mental processes could arise from information processing within, physical systems like the brain.
Right.
So thinking, knowing, intending, these weren't seen as the actions of a separate, non-physical entity, but as computations, sequences of transformations of information that are stored in the brain
Right.
that could, if they accurately represented the world, lead to intelligent behavior and, successful predictions.
So instead of a mysterious ghost, we have the brain as a kind of biological computer
Exactly.
processing information? Okay.
Yeah, the mind could be understood in terms of software running on the brain's hardware.
Okay.
So it's a completely different way of looking at it.
Right. And this led to the idea of universal mental mechanisms, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Once you start thinking about the mind in terms of information processing rather than just observable behavior, the vast cultural differences we see across humanity start to look a little different.
Okay.
The cognitive revolution suggested that underlying that incredible diversity of human cultures, there are these universal mental mechanisms.
Right.
So these are fundamental ways that all human minds are structured to take in information, process it, and generate responses.
Okay.
And a prime example of this is language. We have, thousands of mutually unintelligible languages.
Right.
Yet the underlying grammatical structures in our brains are remarkably similar,
Okay.
allowing us to generate and understand an infinite number of, novel sentences. And the fact that any language could be used to express any conceivable idea from the mundane to the highly abstract points to this, common underlying cognitive architecture.
Right. So there's this kind of blueprint that all humans share when it comes to language.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this architecture, though, isn't just one big general purpose processor, is it? The cognitive revolution also highlighted this idea of the modularity of the mind.
Right. That's a crucial insight. The mind isn't this single uniform entity. It's understood as being composed of many different specialized parts or modules.
Okay.
Each module has its own kind of dedicated information processing systems designed for specific tasks,
Okay.
like focusing attention, learning motor skills, remembering events,
Okay.
holding information briefly in mind, understanding language, all these different things.
Right. So it's like our brains come pre-equipped with certain ways of understanding and interacting with the world.
Yeah, and beyond these processing systems, there are also content-specific faculties.
Okay.
These are things that are sometimes referred to as multiple intelligences.
Okay.
And they're specialized for dealing with particular kinds of information, like faces, spatial layouts, social cues, and so on.
Right. So this modular view suggests that our brains come, pre-equipped, as you said, with certain ways of understanding the world. It's not just this blank slate waiting to be filled in.
Right, exactly.
And your sources even touch on some fascinating research with split brain patients that supports this idea
Yeah, they do.
of a mind with, specialized components, and particularly this concept of an interpreter in the left hemisphere of the brain. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the split brain studies, where the connections between the two halves of the brain are surgically severed,
Right.
they offer these really intriguing glimpses into how our conscious experience is constructed.
Huh.
So what they found was that the left hemisphere seems to have this kind of, particular tendency to create coherent narratives and explanations for our behavior,
Okay.
even when it doesn't have access to the full information about why we did something.
So it's like our left brain is making up stories to explain what our right brain is doing.
Yeah, pretty much. And there's a really famous example of this where the right hemisphere would direct the left hand to point to a picture of a snow scene.
Okay.
Then the left hemisphere, seeing this, but not knowing why, might then be shown a picture of a chicken claw and point to it with the right hand.
Okay.
And when asked why, the left hemisphere would weave together this story, saying something like, oh, the claw goes with the chicken and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken coop in the winter snow.
Wow.
But the remarkable thing is, the left hemisphere isn't aware of the right hemisphere's initial choice.
Right.
It just makes up this plausible sounding explanation.
So it's like our conscious self, the voice inside our head, might be more of a storyteller, constantly trying to make sense of what's going on.
Exactly, yeah. It's more like a press secretary or a spin doctor than, the person actually making the decisions.
That's a pretty mind-bending idea. So the cognitive revolution really started to challenge this idea of the blank slate. And then, of course, we have all this evidence from biology and behavior that further challenges this view. And your sources emphasize the heritability of traits.
They do, yes.
So what kinds of traits are we talking about here?
Well, we're not just talking about, physical characteristics like height or eye color.
Okay.
Study after study has shown that things like temperaments, those basic underlying dispositions towards certain moods and behaviors, are partly heritable.
Okay.
But it goes much further than that. Even actual behaviors that have significant social consequences, like the tendency towards antisocial acts.
Yeah, okay.
Lying, stealing, aggression, vandalism, those have been shown to have a heritable component.
So it's not just about how we look, but how we act.
Exactly.
Our genes are playing a role.
Yeah.
Okay. And this even extends to, more complex and troubling conditions like psychopathy, which there seems to be a significant biological basis for.
Yeah, the research on psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder provides some, really compelling evidence for a genetic contribution.
Okay.
Many individuals diagnosed with psychopathy, they show these signs of, callous, manipulative behavior from a very young age, often despite having, seemingly normal upbringings.
Really?
Yeah. And, things like cruelty to animals, persistent lying, lack of empathy or remorse. These are things that, often show up very early on.
So even with good parenting, these traits can still emerge?
It seems so, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And, while early brain damage can sometimes be a factor, the overwhelming consensus is that genetics plays a really significant role in the development of these psychopathic traits.
Okay, so biology is really showing us that we're not arriving as completely unprogrammed beings. But what about evolutionary psychology?
Right. How does that field further contribute to this discussion?
Well, evolutionary psychology approaches the mind from this perspective of natural selection.
Okay.
The argument is that just as our physical characteristics show clear signs of being shaped by evolution to serve specific functions, so too does our brain.
Right.
And all of its various cognitive and emotional mechanisms.
Okay.
So, abilities that we often take for granted, like
Right.
our capacity to categorize objects, to understand cause and effect, recognize faces, experience fundamental motivations like hunger, fear, love, desire for status.
Right.
These are actually incredibly complex computational feats.
Right.
And evolutionary psychologists propose that these abilities evolved because they enhanced our ancestors' survival and reproductive success in the environments they faced.
So our brains are shaped by the challenges our ancestors faced.
Okay.
And it's important to clarify what adaptation means in this evolutionary context, because it's not always about what we consciously perceive as beneficial or morally good. That's a really critical distinction. In everyday language, we think of an adaptation as something that improves our well-being or promotes social harmony.
Right.
But in evolutionary biology, an adaptation is simply a trait that was favored by natural selection because it increased the likelihood of the genes responsible for that trait being passed on to the next generation.
Right.
Natural selection is a blind, mechanistic process.
It's not about morality.
Not at all. It's about effective gene replication.
Right.
Richard Dawkins famously described these genes as the selfish ones.
Right.
Or maybe more accurately, the ones that are most effective at making copies of themselves.
Okay.
So an adaptation is any trait, whether it's physical or psychological, that helps those genes achieve that goal,
Right.
regardless of whether it aligns with our conscious desires or societal ideals.
So sometimes our adaptations can be, at odds with what we consider to be good or moral.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. And this evolutionary lens also sheds light on that noble savage idea, particularly when we look at the evidence for violence in pre-state societies. So what does that evidence actually suggest?
Well, it presents a bit of a challenge to that romanticized image of inherently peaceful, noble savages.
Right.
Now, there's, of course, a sensitivity around discussing violence in pre-state societies, because historically those ideas have been used to justify, all kinds of terrible things.
Right. Colonialism, exploitation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the anthropological and archaeological records indicate that violence was actually quite prevalent in many hunter-gatherer societies.
So the idea that they lived in this kind of peaceful harmony is not really supported by the evidence?
No, not really. Now, this doesn't mean humans have this innate bloodlust or anything like
Right.
that. It just means that in the environments in which we evolved, violence could sometimes be a strategic adaptation.
Okay.
In situations of resource scarcity or intergroup competition. However, It's also really important to acknowledge that evolution has favored cooperation and conflict resolution. These behaviors enhance survival and reproduction as well. So while the capacity for violence may be part of human nature, so too is the capacity for peace and collaboration.
Okay. So it's more complex than just saying humans are inherently violent or inherently peaceful.
Much more complex.
Yeah. Okay. Now, moving beyond these, more primal aspects of human nature, our lives in complex societies are really built on these social realities.
Right.
Things like money, laws, institutions. So how do these fit into this nature-nurture debate?
Well, social realities, as your sources explain, really highlight this fascinating interplay between our inherent cognitive abilities and the shared agreements that kind of underpin our societies.
Okay.
So something like money or the legal system, they only exist because a large number of people within a community agree to treat them as real.
Right. It's a collective delusion in a way.
It is, yeah.
Right.
But this depends on our individual cognitive capacity to understand these, abstract social contracts.
Right. So we have to have certain mental abilities in order to create and maintain these social realities.
Exactly.
Okay. And how does an evolutionary perspective explain this incredible diversity and also the similarities that we see across different cultures? This idea of culture as accumulated innovation seems really central here.
Right. Instead of viewing culture as this kind of arbitrary set of rules and symbols imposed on a blank slate, an evolutionary perspective sees it as this vast collection of useful technologies, practices, social innovations that humans have accumulated over time to help them survive and thrive.
It's like a toolbox that we've been building for millennia.
Exactly. And when different groups of humans become isolated from each other, whether geographically or socially, these innovations that arise in one group, they can't easily spread to others.
Okay.
So over time, as each isolated group continues to adapt to their local conditions and develop their own unique solutions to the challenges they face, their cultures naturally diverge.
Right. So it's like evolution, but in the cultural realm.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And this process of cultural evolution with its branching and diversification, it's very similar to how, languages evolve.
It is, yeah.
And how new species arise in the biological world.
Exactly.
Your sources even offer a compelling case study with Tasmania,
right,
highlighting how isolation can lead to cultural loss, not just accumulation.
Yeah, that's right. The case of Tasmania is a really striking example.
So tell us about that.
So when European explorers arrived in the 19th century, the Tasmanian Aboriginal people had, what was considered the most technologically simple culture known.
Really?
Yeah. They'd lost many technologies that their ancestors possessed when they first arrived from the Australian mainland, thousands of years earlier.
Wow.
Including things like, fire making, using percussion, boomerangs, sophisticated stone tools. They even lost the ability to effectively catch fish using specialized tools. Yeah, and archaeological evidence suggests that these technologies were gradually lost over, 10,000 years of isolation after that land bridge to Australia was submerged.
Wow. So they were cut off and their technology actually regressed.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this demonstrates that cultural knowledge isn't always guaranteed to accumulate progressively.
Right. It can go backwards.
Yeah, it can. Yeah, if there's no contact with other cultures and no strong pressure to reinvent lost skills.
Right. So instead of culture being this kind of autonomous force shaping us from scratch, it's more like a product of our inherent human needs and cognitive abilities.
Right.
And it can be both gained and lost, depending on the circumstances.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, this leads to this argument for grounding history and culture in biology.
Right.
But, a lot of people are understandably uneasy about what they perceive as reductionism.
They are.
So how do your sources address this concern?
Well, it's a valid concern. I mean, the idea of grounding history and culture in psychology, which in turn is grounded in, neuroscience, genetics, and evolutionary biology, it can sound like we're trying to reduce the richness and complexity of human experience to, mere biological processes.
Yeah, it feels very simplistic.
It can.
Yeah.
But leading researchers, in these sciences of human nature, they emphasize that mental life needs to be understood at multiple levels of analysis.
Okay.
Not just the lowest, biological level.
Yeah.
And they refer to these frameworks proposed by, thinkers like Noam Chomsky, David Marr, Nico Tinbergen.
Right.
Who outlined different but complementary ways of understanding a mental faculty.
Okay.
Like, for instance, its ultimate function, why it evolved, its real-time operation, how it works.
Okay.
Its neural implementation in the brain, how it develops and